And welcome. So glad to be here with all of you. It's going to be a great stream tonight. Going to be a great conversation. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. A lot of great things that we can discuss here tonight. A lot of things to show you. A lot of interesting information to share, as always. So I really look forward to it. Tweet this out, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell, share this on Reddit, share this on Facebook. Yep, let's just jump right into it.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Hey, everybody. Welcome. I want to wish you all a very, very happy 152nd birthday of Vladimir Lenin. Today is Vladimir Lenin's 152nd birthday. And you probably did not notice that because there's another holiday that has been named on Vladimir Lenin's birthday. And I've got plenty to say about that. But I wanted to start out by telling you a story. That's how I'm going to start out tonight's stream. I'm going to tell you a story. Once upon a time, there was a caveman named Og. And Og was going out hunting. And Og went into the forest, and he was looking for an animal to kill and feed his family with. And he was looking around the forest. He thought maybe he'd get a deer, kill the deer to feed his family with. He couldn't find a deer. Thought maybe he'd get a rabbit, kill the rabbit to feed his family. Couldn't find it. Og was looking around. He couldn't find anything. Couldn't find a squirrel. Couldn't find a moose. Og could not find anything to kill to feed his family. So Og paused for a moment, and he said, all right, maybe I can find some nuts and gather some nuts. He looked up and down the forest, couldn't find any nuts. Thought maybe I can get some berries. So he went up and down the forest, looked, couldn't find any berries. He thought maybe I can gather some fruit. He looked up and down the forest. Og was looking for some fruit, but he could not find any fruit. Then Og started thinking, and he realized that his tribe had significantly increased. That his family had, his generation of hunter-gatherers, it had more children than the previous generation of hunter-gatherers. And that his parents' generation had more children than his generation of hunter-gatherers. And that probably the reason that Og couldn't find any elk or moose or deer or rabbits or squirrels to kill, and probably the reason he couldn't find any fruits and nuts, was because there were more people than there had been before. They had been reproducing at a faster rate. So Og scratched his head and said, how can I possibly resolve this situation? What can we do? What can we possibly do to resolve this situation? And Og realized there was only one solution. So Og went back to his cave, and his family, that were expecting him to come home with a deer or an elk or at least some berries or some nuts, they walked in and they were quite disappointed to see Og come home empty-handed. And they were quite worried. They said, Og, why don't you have any deer or rats or berries or fruits or nuts for us to eat? And he said, don't worry, I have the answer. So he lined up his 10 children and killed 5 of them. And everyone lived happily ever after. The end. Isn't it a beautiful story? Isn't it a beautiful story? Og solved the ecological crisis. He realized that there's just too much consumption going on. They were eating too many fruits and nuts. They were eating too many deer, and he was having too many children. So Og solved the problem. He just killed half of his children, and everything was fine. And humanity has lived in caves ever since. And we've continued hunting and gathering. And if there just get to be too many people, you just got to kill people. You just got to reduce the population, reduce consumption, and everything worked out. And is that what happened? Is that what happened in the history of the human race? Did we realize we were over consuming during the first great ecological crisis, during the first great scarcity? Is that how we resolved it? Did Og just come home and say, Og, not find enough berries. Og, not find enough wild animal. Og, kill half of family. Og, problem. Og, reduce consumption. Is that how we solve the problem? I don't think so. That is a fictional story that I just shared with you. I mean, who knows? Something like that could have happened. But we all know what ultimately happened. That when there was a scarcity of animals to hunt, and when there was a scarcity of fruits and nuts to gather, human beings decided to start growing their own food, raising and domesticating animals, growing crops, farming. And this is how the ecological crisis, the great ecological crisis that happened 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, was resolved with the agricultural revolution. Soylent Green, warn it. We'll talk about that. I've seen that movie. All right. Just writing it down. Thank you, Christian. And that's how human beings resolved the first great ecological crisis, was they changed the way that they interacted with their environment. The way that they were interacting with their environment, hunting and gathering, was no longer sustainable because they got too good at it, and their means of existence, their lives became more and more comfortable. And as a result of that, it got to the point that they couldn't keep hunting and gathering any longer. So they reinvented the way they interact with their environment. They changed the mode of production. That is how we resolved the first great ecological crisis. By going forward, not backward. By changing the way we interact with our environment to be more sustainable. That's a word you hear a lot, especially on Earth Day. Sustainability. Sustainability. Meaning that the way that you interact with your environment isn't short term. It's not going to stop working. You're not going to run out of resources in a year or two. It's sustainable, meaning that it's long term and strategic. Sustainable development. And that, yes, as human beings have gotten to higher modes of production, the modes of production they develop are more sustainable, more long term. And this seems pretty much like common sense when it comes to issues like environmentalism. It's pretty basic stuff, right? That when one mode of production is unsustainable, when the old way does not work, you must move to another way. That is how human beings resolve problems. They get to a higher plane. When feudalism wasn't working anymore, we moved toward capitalism. And now, as we face the unsustainability of capitalism and the way we are interacting with our environment is creating a crisis of climate change, and there's irrational competition between corporations, and there's a scramble to control the oil markets by the imperialists, it's pretty clear we need to move toward a higher mode of production. This is the solution to the environmental crisis, and it's pretty basic. It's pretty, this isn't rocket science, as they say. This is pretty basic stuff. However, this is not the prevailing viewpoint that you get from the environmental movement. If you go listen to the environmental folks, you'll get a very, very different message. And that's why I wanted to mention, if I may, that the first Earth Day ever to happen, took place in the year 1970. It was 1970 was the first Earth Day. And in 1970, I'm trying to figure out how to show the clips I've got for tonight. It's just nothing is cooperating. Technical difficulties. That's okay. We always get through these things. 1970, April 22nd. It was the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth. Lenin was born in 1870. April 22nd, 1870. Vladimir Lenin was born. And you will notice that it was 100 years later, after the birth of Lenin, it was 100 years later that they had the first Earth Day, April 22nd, 1970. Now, some people will look into that, and the only people that really talk about this are the far right. And they will bring this up and they'll say, oh, that's because of the fact that environmentalists are all commies, right? Environmentalists are all a bunch of commie reds, and they want to pass legislation to control the means of production and take profits away from big business owners. They want to make a law that says we can't pollute. That violates the free market. I want to make money from corporations. I want to make money from polluting, and these darn hippies are all a bunch of commies, and they're taking it away from me. Well, obviously, that's not why. That is not why the first Earth Day was held on Lenin's birthday. That is not the reason. It's not. And you can think that if you want. I can't stop you, right? But that is not the reason the first Earth Day was held on Lenin's birthday. You have to think about what was going on in 1970. The political atmosphere was very, very different back in 1970 than it is today. Very, very different atmosphere. Things were changed. Things were quite different. And at that point in 1970, the global communist movement was quite massive. There was quite a large number of people in the world that were attracted to Marxist and socialist ideas. And it was not a small group of people. You had the Soviet Union in existence, a massive socialist, Marxist-Leninist country. You had China, one quarter of humanity, led by the Communist Party, and still are today. You had a number of African countries that were moving towards socialism. You had African socialism on the march. Julius Nyerere was in power in Tanzania. You had various Marxist revolutionary groups throughout Latin America that had a lot of influence and power. Fidel Castro was in power in Cuba. All throughout the world, you had communist parties with millions and millions of members of these countries' communist parties. And April 22nd, 1970 was a pretty big day. It was a pretty big day because of the fact that April 22nd, 1970 was the day that there were going to be celebrations all over the planet. Celebrations all across the planet. Sorry, trying to get all these clips in order. Wanted to start on time, and that means we're scrambling to get everything done. There were going to be celebrations all across the planet for the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth. And there were huge celebrations. In the town where Lenin was born, they had a huge celebration where Brezhnev gave a speech, on the legacy of Lenin and what Lenin stood for. There was a children's book about Lenin that was published, presenting Lenin as kind of an inspiration for children and kind of a hero to Soviet children. There was a statue dedicated to Lenin in East Germany. There were demonstrations and parades in many Middle Eastern countries. China put out a document saying that they were the true inheritors of Lenin's legacy and that the Soviet Union had betrayed the legacy of Lenin. A lot of stuff was happening. A lot of stuff was going on. A lot of stuff was happening. And yeah, that's what was going on at that time. And at the same time, there was a political crisis in the United States. The Vietnam War was raging, and it was quite unpopular. The Black Liberation Movement was in full swing. The Black Panthers were rising and were very, very popular. Many people were joining the Black Panther Party. There was Black Panther and Black Liberation organizations everywhere. Richard Nixon was president. There were millions of young people that were interested in communism and socialism and Marxism. Shortly after the first Earth Day, a few weeks afterwards, was the Kent State Massacre. 4 dead in Ohio. May 4th, 1970, you had 4 students gunned down at Kent State University for protesting. Okay. And it was a time of intense political turmoil. And many of the people leading the unrest and political turmoil in the United States were communists. The main activist group on the college campuses was called Students for a Democratic Society. And it was divided between 2 communist factions, the Progressive Labor Party and the Revolutionary Youth Movement, which became the Weathermen or the Weather Underground. And those 2 factions dominated it. They were both Maoist communists, but one of them didn't like the Black Panthers, was sectarian towards the Black Panthers. The other was supporting the Black Panthers. One of them wanted young people to get jobs in factories, and one of them wanted young people to go out and break windows and engage in ultra-left adventurous street fighting. But Students for a Democratic Society was dominated completely by Marxist-Leninist communists. Meanwhile, the Black Panthers, they were a Marxist-Leninist communist organization, if there ever was one. They sent delegations to North Korea. Mao's little red book was required reading. And they were, if there was ever a group of people that were communists, it was the Black Panthers. And during the Vietnam War, there were soldiers refusing to fight. And, the American Servicemen's Union was formed, and Vietnam Veterans Against the War was formed. And soldiers in the Vietnam War and in the military itself were opposing the war and refusing to fight. And things were in a state of turmoil. And there was a fear that if all these people in the United States, all these African Americans who were angry at the U.S. government and were inspired by the Black Panthers, all these college students who didn't want to fight in the Vietnam War and were protesting, all these soldiers who wanted to, didn't want to be in the Vietnam War and were refusing to fight and were killing their officers, etc. There was a feeling among the ruling class that if on April 22nd, people turned on their TVs and saw what was happening around the world and saw the huge parades for Lenin on every continent, and saw the face of this bald guy with a goatee mustache whose writings talked about building a new society, who had created the government that raised the Soviet Union up from nothing and made it a global superpower, who inspired China to lift up its head and liberate women from foot binding, inspired Cuba to industrialize and build itself up. And, that if people in the United States saw that, become even more radicalized and even more revolutionary. Glad you liked it. Andy Stapp was a great man. There's a lot of fear about that. So, Republicans and a Republican president named Richard Nixon created a new national holiday. And it was on Lenin's birthday. And the first one was celebrated on Lenin's birthday, April 22nd. And the first Earth Day was celebrated. There were big gatherings where there were members of Congress and politicians, Democrats and Republicans. They all got together and said, we ought to have some environmental regulations. We ought to pass the Clean Air Act. We ought to not pollute environmental problems. Before the EPA was passed, before the EPA was, people about how in Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. I don't know if people have ever heard of this, but in Cleveland, Ohio, that was an industrial town. It was a lot of steel mills down by the river. And so much dumping in Cuyahoga County, Ohio, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught on fire and was on fire. How do you have a river catch on fire? It's wet. How do you have a river catch on fire? But that's what happened. River caught on fire. And, it was very bad. The amount of air pollution there was, it was hard to breathe in New York City. The smog was so bad. And it was pretty bad. So we don't want to pretend that the EPA was a bad thing. It wasn't a bad thing to pass the Environmental Protection Agency and create that. It wasn't a bad thing to pass the Clean Air Act. A bad thing to dumping pollution into the water. It wasn't a bad thing. Right. Okay. Not a bad thing. However, at the same time, the message being put out by most of the people at the big Earth Day gatherings was that growth must not continue, that somehow growth is bad. The Club of Rome, a couple of years later, a big think tank based in Italy, endorsed by all the major politicians, put out this document, The Limits to Growth, that predicted that by about the year 2000, the global economy would collapse. We would run out of oil. We'd run out of aluminum. We'd run out of necessary resources. And a couple of years later, the Carter administration came out with their Global 2000 report saying roughly the same thing. They started talking about overpopulation. There's too many people in the world. And all of this was in response to what Lenin had started. Because there's a reason. There's a reason that at that time in the 1970s, consumption was rising. Why was it in the 1970s that humanity was consuming more oil? Why was it in the 1970s that humanity was consuming more coal? Why was it in the 1970s that there was a rise in the population significantly? Why was this happening? It was happening because of Lenin, because of socialism. Who built the first power plant in the Middle East? The first hydroelectrical power plant, the biggest hydroelectrical power plant in the Middle East, not the first, but the biggest hydroelectrical power plant in the Middle East, was built by Khrushchev and Abdul Nasser. Arab socialism and the Soviet Union teamed up and they built the Aswan Dam. And the reason that Egypt, the country of Egypt, is fully electrified. And yes, that means they're consuming electricity, is because of socialism. If capitalism and imperialism had kept dominating Egypt, they wouldn't have a big power plant called the Aswan Dam, and they wouldn't have full electrification. Why do you think Libya, starting in 1969, started raising its people up from poverty? Because of socialism, because of an alliance with the Soviet Union. Why do you think it was that Cuba, suddenly its rate of consumption was going up? Because it became fully electrified. And the people all had running water in their houses because of socialism, because of Lenin. Why do you think it was that China, the sick man of Asia, one of the poorest countries in the world, suddenly had its own steel mills and its own power plants, and its people were rising up from poverty, new cars were being produced? Why was it? It's because of Lenin. It was because of socialism. And what Lenin had started led to people all throughout what now we are all supposed to call the global South. They started rising up from poverty. Lenin wrote a very, very important book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And he wrote about the way capitalism works. The way capitalism developed was that it holds back development in impoverished countries. It keeps the world poor. That we now have a period defined by the export of capital, where instead of exporting commodities, it used to be a country would export cars or export steel or export products. We don't export products anymore. We export businesses. The export of businesses, enterprises, capitalist enterprises spread their tentacles all across the planet. And they seize the economies of developing countries and they hold back economic development. That's what imperialism is. It is the export of capital, the carving out of spheres of influence by trusts, cartels, and syndicates based in the Western countries. It is about holding back development, crippling developing countries, keeping them in poverty so that they have to buy their products from the West, so that they remain impoverished and dependent. And it's because of imperialism that there's so much malnutrition in Africa. There's whole sections of Africa that don't have access to running water and electricity still today. It's because of imperialism that there's whole sections of Guatemala and Honduras that don't have running water, don't have electricity, don't even have schools. The children are still speaking indigenous languages, not speaking Spanish. It's because of imperialism. It's because of imperialism that people across the country don't have enough food to eat. Imperialism is holding back development. But the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 laid the basis for countries to start breaking out of imperialism. When Russia broke out of the Western capitalist system and imperialism, and Stalin launched his 5-year plans, they suddenly became an industrial superpower. No country was producing more steel than the Soviet Union was. No country was producing more tractors than the Soviet Union was. The Soviet Union was doing amazing things, lifting itself up. They used their own oil resources, and they developed their own oil industry. And it was socialism and Lenin that laid the basis for countries around the world to start rising up from poverty. And the imperialists don't like that. The imperialists were looking at this and saying, oh, shit. Oh, God, this can't be happening. Oh, my God. Oh, my God. This is a nightmare. Those Asians and those Latin American people and those Africans are building their own power plants and building their own steel mills. We can't have this. We've got to reduce consumption. Reduce consumption. And you know what? The people in these countries, in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America, they're having too many people. They're having too many children. They got to stop breeding. You got to stop them from breeding. They're having too many people. The ruling class of the United States did not create Earth Day because they wanted us all to breathe cleaner air. They didn't create Earth Day because they thought it was a travesty. The Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio caught on fire. They created Earth Day specifically because they were on a quest to stop what had started with Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin broke with Karl Marx. There is a difference between Lenin and Marx. Marx thought that socialism would first happen in the first world. It was going to happen in Germany and France and Italy and Britain, and the workers were going to rise up and seize their factories. But Lenin understood that at that time, because of imperialism, because of the export of capital and the spreading of the imperialist tentacles all across the planet, because of that, socialism in the 20th century wasn't going to come from the first world. It wasn't going to come from the United States. It wasn't going to come from Britain and France. It was going to come from the colonized world. It was going to be countries, nations, fighting to be free from imperialist domination. That's where socialism would emerge first. It would be these nations, and it would be nations fighting for their independence as nations. Right? Marx said, no nationalism at all. Workers of the world unite. But Lenin said, no. There's whole countries in Africa, whole countries in Asia, whole countries in Latin America that are oppressed by the imperialists. And it'll be those whole nations fighting to be free. And communists are going to be at the center of the battle to free those nations. And only breaking out of capitalism will really free these nations. So communists are going to be the leaders of the national liberation struggle, but it'll be the battle of countries across the world against imperialism, the battle to break out of imperialism and start industrializing and raising themselves up out of poverty. That will be how socialism comes into the world. That's what Lenin said. And it happened. And it happened. And China's proof of that. And the Soviet Union was proof of that. Modern Russia is proof of that. And Cuba's proof of that. Libya, under the leadership of Gaddafi, was proof of that. Under the leadership of Gaddafi, Libya built the world's largest irrigation system. It had the highest life expectancy in Africa because they broke out of imperialism and used socialism. Cuba has the highest life expectancy in Latin America, a medical system that is loved by people all over the world and admired, for its achievements. Cuba has the best medical school in the world, according to Ban Ki-moon. Breaking out of imperialism, using socialist methods to raise their countries up from poverty. In the 1970s, that was causing an increase in consumption. You bet. More oil was being used, more coal, more timber was being used. Human beings, when they were rising up out of poverty, they were indeed consuming more. And the ruling class wanted to stop it. So rather than having Lenin's birthday, they decided to have Earth Day. I don't even know what you're getting at there. Every effort was made on the part of the ruling class to stop the process that Lenin started. And that's why they created Earth Day on Lenin's birthday. They didn't want the millions of working people in the United States who were radicalized during that period to take inspiration from Lenin. And they also wanted to send a message that what Lenin had started, raising countries out of poverty, raising human beings to a higher plane and a higher mode of existence, had to be stopped. And it was a political statement. It was about reducing consumption rather than breaking people out of poverty. There's a film called Marxism and Energy that was made by my good friend Fox from Space Commune podcast. And he features me narrating in the film Marxism and Energy. I'm going to post the link in the chat to Marxism and Energy. It's about an hour long. It's a great film that Fox from Space Commune made. I'm going to put the link in the chat. It's a whole documentary about this topic. But I'm actually going to show a clip from the film, a clip about Earth Day. So enjoy this. This is a clip.
The fact that all over the world there's going to be this huge communist gathering for the 100th anniversary of Lenin's birth, right? And there's a huge radical movement in the United States of people that are in the streets, and when communist factions are gaining influence in the United States, if you look at what Earth Day was not a communist gathering by any means. It was very much a gathering that was about, we need to regulate industry to some degree in order to curb pollution. But it also pushed forward some of the elements of the environmental movement that were probably the most contrary to Marxism, right? Because a lot of, Marxism is an ideology that's about growth fundamentally. The goal is banks, factories, and industries, the means of production rationally controlled by society, getting rid of the irrational boom-bust cycle and moving to a world of so much material abundance that class differences break down. But a lot of the hippie movement kind of had the opposite. In their aesthetics, they admired the primitivism of the East. They kind of talked about growth being bad. And so you had a holiday that kind of highlighted that aspect of leftism, which was very contrary to the Marxist wing of things.
Just the sense of like people who were not strictly living paycheck to paycheck without a sense of control over their own destiny. They have some capital, they have some land, they have some networks, something that gives them a sense of power. And therefore, the space to think about systems and the kind of system that matches how they would approach the world. And I think I can see, Fox, you mentioned, the decline of the New Left. There's something to that, right? Like the collapse of mass movements.
But it gets better, folks. It gets better. I've just told you the first half of it. The first half is all that I've told you, but there is more. There is much, much more, folks. There's more. Let me go on. So, in addition to the fact that there is indeed a holiday created called Earth Day. One interesting fact that doesn't often get brought up, sometimes you will hear it brought up by the right wing. They will bring it up again to feed this idea. The environmentalists are all a bunch of commies who want to take my stuff and I hate them. In order to feed their narrative, you will sometimes hear the right wing bring up that an individual who has often been referred to as the man who invented Earth Day, he wasn't that. He didn't invent Earth Day. He wasn't the guy who invented Earth Day, but he was certainly heavily involved in it. He was the guy who oversaw the first Earth Day celebration in Philadelphia. He was the MC at the Earth Day gathering in Philadelphia and was kind of considered to be one of the most prominent hippies in Philadelphia. Ira Einhorn, who claimed, he went around saying he was the man who invented Earth Day. That's not exactly true. Ira Einhorn is known to the world not as the guy who claimed to have invented Earth Day, not as a guy who was the MC at the first Earth Day celebration. Ira Einhorn is known to the world as the Unicorn Killer. Did you know about this? Ira Einhorn, the guy who was widely considered to be the father of Earth Day, is known to the world as the Unicorn Killer. Ira Einhorn lived in Philadelphia, and he was one of the most well-known and popular hippies. He was the MC who ran the stage at the first Earth Day celebration where all these senators and congressmen spoke. He had long hair and a beard, and he was all like, peace, brother, and everyone knew him as Unicorn. That was his hippie name, because Einhorn means one horn. His last name means one horn. So they started calling him Unicorn, and he was Brother Unicorn. And he walked around, he was hip, he was Brother Unicorn, guy who created Earth Day, Brother Unicorn, listens to Jimi Hendrix and does lots of drugs and gave everybody acid, and he was Brother Unicorn. Well, Brother Unicorn, he had a girlfriend. And Brother Unicorn was apparently quite jealous, was afraid that his girlfriend might cheat on him, was angry with his girlfriend. So Brother Unicorn, the father of Earth Day, Brother Unicorn killed his girlfriend. And I guess he was just very, very environmental, a very, very environmentally conscious dude. Brother Unicorn, he did not embalm her because that would use formaldehyde and that would not be environmental. Brother Unicorn mummified her like an ancient Egyptian in his apartment. So he murdered his girlfriend and then he mummified her and he kept her dead body in the closet for months. Eventually, the girlfriend's family are like, where is she? And the girlfriend's, friends were all looking for her. And eventually the police got a search warrant for his apartment. And they looked in his closet and they found a mummy, a preserved, mummified body of Ira Einhorn's girlfriend. Ira Einhorn became known to the world as the Unicorn Killer, the guy who started Earth Day. But it gets better. It gets better, folks. It gets better than that. Ira Einhorn was taken to jail, charged with murder. And, generally, if you're charged with murder, they don't give you bail. But Ira Einhorn, Brother Unicorn, was very well connected. He wasn't just some hippie off the street. No, he knew members of Congress. He knew members of the city council. And so when it was time for him to ask for bail, members of the Philadelphia City Council spoke on his behalf. Members of Congress spoke on his behalf. All kinds of prominent elected officials said, no, this must be a mistake. Ira Einhorn must never have done this. Brother Unicorn is an upstanding community organizer, an environmentalist. He's a good guy. He wouldn't have done it. He couldn't have done it. And we don't think he's a flight risk. And so the judge, seeing that there were all these prominent politicians and prominent people, gave him bail. And it was not a low bail. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars. And some wealthy, ultra-rich Canadian socialite paid his bail. And so, pending murder charges, Ira Einhorn was let out of jail. And then he disappeared. He vanished. And Ira Einhorn was gone. And no one knew what happened to him. The Unicorn Killer was at large. This was the late 70s. All throughout the 1980s, nobody knew where he was. All throughout the 1990s, they didn't know. They finally found him in the mid-90s. And where was Ira Einhorn? Where was Brother Unicorn? Brother Unicorn was living in the south of France, writing for websites under a different name. And so there was a big, long extradition battle. Big, long extradition battle to get Ira Einhorn back to the United States. And he ultimately, in the mid-2000s, got sent back to the United States. And back in the United States, he died in prison at the beginning of the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, Ira Einhorn died. What's interesting is that Ira Einhorn maintained his innocence. He maintained that he didn't do it. And when they were trying to extradite him from France, he testified that he had inside information about government experiments and that he knew about secret weapons programs from the CIA, and that's why they had framed him. He claimed he was framed. They'd killed his girlfriend, mummified her, and framed him up. And then he knew about secret government programs by the CIA, etc., and that's why he was being extradited. That's why they'd gone after him. That's why they'd framed him. It's a pretty wild story. Pretty wild story. But again, how relevant is it, right? Am I saying that Earth Day is a murderer holiday? No. Am I saying that because this guy was involved in creating the first Earth Day, that proves every environmentalist is a murdering psychopath? Of course, I'm not saying that. But it's interesting because, first of all, the dude who was the face of Earth Day was not a good dude, murdered his girlfriend. Pretty awful, number one. Number two, he seemed to have a lot of very, very powerful friends who were able to get him out of jail and whisk him out of the country and hide him in France for decades. And that points to the fact that the environmental movement is not simply some kind of grassroots, there's just working people who just, that some of this stuff comes from the top. Some of this stuff, in fact, comes from the top, and we should be aware of that. And Einhorn, it's a very dark story. Look at the origins of Earth Day. It's a very, very dark story. Very, very dark. Ira Einhorn was not Lenin, I'll tell you that much. And that's an interesting angle on all of this. Now, at the same time, today, Earth Day, there were a lot of people in the streets protesting. And there was actually a gathering in Boston. And one of our CPI comrades, good close comrade of mine, Lily Goldklang, actually went to the demonstration that was held, the Earth Day rally that was held in Boston. And Lily was actually able to do an interview with two prominent individuals. And so I'm actually just going to show Lily's great interview that she did. This is the interview that Lily did with Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate for president. The famous 2016 Green Party candidate for president. Lily interviewed her, and it was a great interview. She asked her some very good questions. So I'm going to show that interview right here. This is Lily Goldklang's interview with Jill Stein. Now, later, I'm going to post just a video of the entire Earth Day thing. Lily got some great footage. I'm editing it together for this channel. It's going to be called Lenin's Birthday in Boston 2022. But this is what Jill Stein said to Lily here on Earth Day.
On a fairly regime change course of action.
Thank you for those words. One more last question, a little bit of a fun one. Are you aware, and if so, do you have any thoughts on today being Vladimir Lenin's birthday?
I didn't know that. Thank you for letting me know. What can I say about that? Well, he got something, what shall we say, earth-shaking started, and that tug of war continues, the battle between capitalism and the crises that it invariably leads to, and this question of what is a better way forward. So we're still working on that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stein. Great words today.
Yeah, that was a great interview. That clip, see again, technical difficulties. CPI delegates to unionization efforts. I don't know what that means. But that's a great clip. That's actually not the whole interview. For some reason, I told you we're having a little bit of technical difficulties today. So I'm just going to drop the link to Lily's whole interview. It's on Lily's channel. I'm just going to drop it here in the chat. This is Lily's whole interview with Dr. Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate. She got her to talk about Ukraine. She got her to talk about the shelling of Donbass, about economics, about a lot of things. So I'm just going to drop that right here. All right, this is Lily's interview with Jill Stein. And we'll be posting. I've got a whole video I'm editing together. She interviewed quite a few people. Now, one of the other people that Lily interviewed was a great friend of ours, a great friend of the Center for Political Innovation, a great friend of Jimmy Dore. She's part of the Revolutionary Blackout Network, Sabi Sobs. So go and subscribe to Lily's channel and check out her interview with Jill Stein. But also, I would recommend, I'm actually going to pull up her interview with Sabi Sobs. Sabi Sobs also gave us some comments at Earth Day in Boston. This is Sabi Sobs of Revolutionary Blackout Network. Oh, boy. YouTube is being obnoxious, right? But that's okay. That's okay. Not YouTube. It's... All right. There we go. Okay, here we go. Here's Sabi Sobs.
So I'm out at the Earth Day rally in Boston. I'm here with Sabrina Salvani of the Savvy Sabs podcast. I was just going to talk with her a little bit. She just gave a great talk on free speech and social media censorship. Could you talk a little bit about that and how they're kind of coming after people?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest problems that we're facing is censorship on a lot of these platforms. That includes like YouTube, Spotify, Twitter, Facebook, all of the social applications, and they've just been removing people. So we've had people in RBN like do live streams about Russia and Ukraine, and they're just cutting the live streams, so people don't hear what we have to say. Google actually sent an email to YouTube creators telling us that they would remove any content that discusses Russia and Ukraine basically against the mainstream narrative. So I know Jackson Hinkle had a Ukraine stream that was also cut. So it's not just us, like they're doing it to everybody. A lot of people have had their channels removed. Anyone that has been affiliated with RT or had a main show on RT, they were all removed. Chris Hedges, Abby Martin, Lee Camp, Tara Reid. Lee Camp and Tara Reid were also removed from Spotify, by the way. So it's not just YouTube, that's the thing. But they really don't want people to hear the truth. They don't want that message to come out. And I think one of the biggest issues that I have is the United States government and Hollywood have pretty much brainwashed the American people that we need to have like this solidarity with Ukraine. And that's not saying that we don't feel sorry for people there, but I don't see any Yemen flags or any Somalia flags in people's Twitter bio because mainstream media doesn't discuss what's going on there. And I highly recommend that people look up pictures from Yemen so you can see exactly what's happening there. And the United States government gave arms to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is using those weapons to kill people in Yemen. So we are complicit, we are very much at fault, and they don't even talk about it. And so it angers me. It seems like the only time they want us to have some type of solidarity is when it's for people who have blonde hair and blue eyes. They don't want us to have solidarity with people of color. So a lot of us have just been going through the censorship, and again, like I said, I have to be careful about what I say and how I say it. I can't put it in the title.
Yeah.
It's tricky.
Well, I guess speaking of how they want us to have basically solidarity with anyone who's not, a person of color. Could you talk about what's going on with Alice Walker right now, if you've been following that?
So that's interesting. I just received an email yesterday discussing an event that Alice Walker is hosting, and it said that that not agreeing with Israel, that doesn't mean that you're anti-Semitic. So that event, I believe, is happening this weekend. I have to double check. But yeah, Alice Walker, she's not just a writer, she's also an activist, and she's pretty outspoken. So I seriously hope they don't try to like silence her. But she's another one. I need to try to see if I can get her on. But yeah, that event is going around. We're sharing it to people through other emails as well. But yeah, they're coming after Alice Walker too.
Okay, I guess two more questions. So could you talk about what is kind of going on in Ukraine right now and all the factors involved? This isn't your channel, so you don't have to. You can speak a little more freely.
So here's the problem. From what I have researched, this has been an issue for the past 8 years. It's not like this conflict came out of nowhere, right? Russia, Ukraine, and the United States government are all at fault here. It's not just Russia. But the problem is, if you say that to people, you are smeared as like a Putin like simp or something like that. It's just absolutely ridiculous. So what people have to understand is the reason why the United States wants you to be anti-Russia is because Russia is another country that really, for the most part, does not need the United States government. So similar to China, right? This is why the United States government is going to go after countries like Russia and countries like China, because they can make it on their own. The United States government wants to be the number one country in the world. They want to be the number one economic power. And any country that comes up close behind them, they are going to see as a threat. I highly recommend that if people aren't doing this, that they follow the Gray Zone, that they follow Convo Couch. Abby Martin, I think, has done some reporting about Russia, Ukraine too, so that you can hear the other side of the story. So it's just unfortunate. It's really sad, and there's no solidarity with the citizens in Russia that are also suffering as well. So the United States government has posed several sanctions on them. The sanctions have to stop. So when I say that I'm anti-war, that includes economic, because that also, in my opinion, is still war, and still the people are devastated.
Last question is kind of a more fun one. Are you aware of it? If you are, how do you feel about today being Lenin's birthday? Vladimir Lenin's birthday.
Yeah, that was interesting. I didn't realize that at first, but I think it speaks to volumes, right? I mean, it's Earth Day and it's his birthday. I think we need to spend more time talking about like what Lenin preached and his philosophy. I think that's important, and that's something we've been focusing on more over at RBN. Defining socialism to people. What does it really mean based on what people think it means? So we're trying to educate people about that, and I wish more people would, just follow that, and so you can learn more about it before you bash socialism and not really knowing what it is.
Great. Thank you so much, Abby.
Very good. And Lily does great interviews. It's really, really great stuff. I can't wait to post the whole video that I just edited earlier today of the Lenin's birthday, Earth Day in Boston. But at the same time, I wanted to just end by pointing out why it is that limited resources, Malthusianism, the idea that there's a limit to growth, the idea that somehow economic growth is a bad thing, why these ideas are fundamentally contradictory to Marxism. Because Marx makes very, very clear, if you read Marx's writing, that the problem with capitalism is not that it creates growth. That is not the problem with capitalism. The problem is not that capitalism leads to people having too much stuff. The problem is not that capitalism, has people raised out of poverty. The problem is not that capitalism enables people to have electricity and have running water. That is not the problem. The problem is the opposite. The problem is that capitalism largely gets in the way of human development. The problem with capitalism is that poverty is created under capitalism by abundance. Under capitalism, people become homeless because there are too many houses. Under capitalism, people become hungry because there's too much food. Under capitalism, poverty is created by abundance. You have poverty amid plenty. And the more stuff you have, the poorer people get. The capitalist is driving as hard as he possibly can to produce goods. And as a result of that, fewer and fewer workers are needed in production. He's always advancing technology, reducing the role of the worker at the assembly line. Fewer and fewer workers are needed to produce goods. The wages of the workers are constantly going down, and the capitalist is churning out more products than he ever can before. Soon the market is glutted with products that cannot be sold. And that is the problem of capitalism, that in systems of the past, people were homeless because there wasn't enough housing. But under capitalism, people are homeless because there's too much housing. Systems of the past, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food. Under capitalism, people become hungry because there is too much food. People get cold in the wintertime because there's too much heating gas. This is the irrationality of the capitalist system. And the goal of Marxists is to have the banks, factories, and industries and the centers of economic power subject to rational planning beyond the profit system, beyond the rule of the dollar, the chaos of the market, the anarchy of production. It is to have the means of production the banks, factories, and industries, the commanding heights of economic power controlled by society. And with public ownership of the means of production, with a planned economy, with a government of action that fights for working families and organizes the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few, growth will no longer be restrained. Growth can be unleashed to even higher and higher levels. And human beings can go to an even higher plane, no longer restricted by the irrationality of the market. And it is the expansion of productive forces that lays the basis for communism, for a world without any inequality. This is from the Critique of the Goethe Program by Karl Marx. He talks about how in socialism, he's first talking about socialism, and how in a socialist society there's going to be inequalities. He says, but these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it has just emerged from the prolonged birth pangs of capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. Let me repeat that phrase. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development thereby. Feudalism didn't exist because people just didn't have the morality to understand that free speech and freedom of religion are good things. Feudalism existed because right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development thereby. Feudalism coincided with society at that level of development. And it was the development of the printing press, the development of the Silk Road from Asia, the development of all kinds of breakthroughs in the Renaissance that laid the basis for a higher mode of production. And we overthrew feudalism and we moved toward capitalism. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. In a higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. After labor has become not only a means of life's prime want, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. Karl Marx is describing the ultimate goal of communism. After the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished. A society where you're no longer a college professor or an auto mechanic or a carpenter. A society where the division of labor has broken down, where people are no longer assigned one trade. After labor becomes not only a means of life, but life's prime want, meaning people only work because they want to. They want to work. They don't have to work. A society where people don't have to work. They do it because they want to, because it's a way to not be bored, because it's entertaining. After the productive forces have increased the all-around development of the individual, meaning that because of so much wealth exists, individuals are no longer subject to authoritarian control, telling them what they have to do and what they can't do. They get to be themselves more. They get to be individuals more because they're not threatened by the whip of hunger. People get to be themselves. People get to explore who they are. You get to be individuals because they're no longer restrained by the desire to, the necessity of working hard all the time. All the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly. Only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribed on its banners, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. Communism, the goal of a stateless, classless world, is only possible with vast material abundance. You can only break down inequality when there's enough to go around for everybody. You can only get rid of the need for a government and a state when there's so much to go around for everybody that there would be no rational reason for anybody to steal. You can only get rid of the division between physical and mental labor when there's enough that people can just do what they feel like doing. You have to reach a higher plane. Communism, the higher stage of communism, is only possible with vast material abundance. It's the only way that you can have the higher stage of communism. You have to have so much more wealth than we can even imagine. So if you think the problem is that there's too much growth, if you think that wealth in and of itself is bad, if you think that there should be limits on growth, you have to abandon the goal of getting to a stateless, classless world. You have to. That's what you have to do. You have to do that. And the problem of the 20th century, we saw in China with the Cultural Revolution. We saw some in the Soviet Union. We saw in the early years of Cuba with Che Guevara's economic policies. We saw most explicitly with Pol Pot, was that because socialism first came to the developing world, because socialism first came to countries that had been kept poor, and when those countries had revolutions, they were barricaded and attacked, and they were surrounded. Because of that, there became this illusion that somehow you can create an egalitarian society in poverty. Somehow, even though these countries were poor, even though they weren't even at the technological level that the West was at, somehow they could have an egalitarian society in poverty. You can't have an egalitarian society in poverty. You can't. You cannot have an egalitarian society in poverty. When there is scarcity, some are going to have more than others, and some are going to hoard and make sure that they have at the expense of somebody else. When there's not enough to go around for everybody, some are going to go without. Social hierarchies, states, governments, all of this, classes, inequality, patriarchy, all of these things are based on scarcity. But when there's enough to go around, when the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, there's no need for that. And that's how inequality breaks down. And the secret to getting to a stateless, classless world is unleashing the productive forces, getting rid of the artificial restraints on production imposed by the capitalist system, the rule of profits. It's the capitalist system and the rule of profits that is keeping countries across Africa underdeveloped. It's the rule of profits and the irrationality of corporations that is keeping the world poor. But socialism and rational planning of the means of production, producing for the benefit of society, not for the profits of the few, lays the basis for wealth to astronomically increase. We got to get off of fossil fuels, folks. We need fusion energy. And that's why China is speeding ahead with fusion energy research, with their artificial sun. They're doing great, amazing stuff. Because they know that it's necessary. They know fossil fuels are unsustainable. They want to get to a higher mode of production. And the market is not in power in China. The state, the Communist Party is in power, and they're saying this needs to be a priority. So it is a priority. The market, the magical invisible hand that these capitalists believe in, it's not doing it. It's not doing it. But that doesn't matter because the Chinese Communist Party says we need fusion energy, and so it happens. That's socialism. Imagine that we had a government right now that said, right now, here in the United States, the roads are crumbling, the infrastructure is falling apart, the water is not being properly purified, bridges are crumbling, power plants are in shambles. We're going to take all this money that we spend on wars around the world, and we're going to hire the unemployed people, pay them all a decent wage to go and rebuild the country. And we're going to mobilize the youth to go out and rebuild America. Make this once again a beautiful country. Not full of potholes, not full of water with lead in it, not full of crumbling schools, but instead, once again, a country that made people proud. Imagine that government went to the fossil fuel companies, the oil companies, the natural gas companies, the coal companies, and said, no, we're going to manage our natural resources now. They're under public ownership. And the wealth that's generated from coal and timber and oil and gas is going to go into the public budget. Imagine we had a government that took control of the banking system and decided that the lending of money would be done on the basis of what was good for the community. In order to ensure growth, in order to ensure development, lending of money would be done strategically, not based on what a private banker said, was profitable and could make him a return on his investment, but based on what was good for the community. Imagine we had a government that enacted an economic bill of rights so that everyone has the right to jobs and schools and housing and food and education. That's what the Center for Political Innovation advocates. A government of action that would fight for working families. No more leaving America and the working people of this country that are struggling at the mercy of an invisible hand, of the magic of the market that's supposed to rescue them. The market has failed. The greed of a wealthy few has left American workers behind. But a government of action, a government based in communities, backed up by popular power, could take decisive action to raise people up out of poverty. And if that government could overcome capitalism, we could move toward a socialist society with a planned economy. That vision of a society where labor becomes life's prime want, not a necessity. People only work because they feel like working. Where the narrow horizon of bourgeois right fades away, that society wouldn't be too far off. But if you believe that growth is the problem, if you believe people rising up out of poverty is the problem, if you believe that there are too many people in the world consuming too many resources, you have to abandon that. You don't believe in Marxism at that point. Marxism is all about growth. It's all about believing that human beings have the ability to get to a higher plane. That Og didn't have to kill half of his children. The solution to the scarcity in hunter-gatherer civilization was moving toward agriculture. It was moving toward a higher plane. And that's the solution for humanity in our time. The crisis of capitalism, the great ecological crisis that we're facing, necessitates moving toward a higher plane, toward rational control of the means of production, toward abolishing capitalism. That is the solution to the climate crisis. That is the solution to our environmental problems. And there's a lot trying to obscure that and hide that from people. And that is something that we have to stand against. Growth is not bad. Wealth is not bad. Capitalism is bad. The exploitation of man by man is bad. The irrational use of resources is bad. Poverty is bad. Scarcity is bad. Inequality is bad. And the road to abolishing these things is growth. There is no limit to human growth. Humans are creative creatures. who in just a few thousand years have gone from hunter-gatherers in the woods, Og, and all the way to space travel and iPhones. Human beings are amazing creatures. And we have a responsibility not to give up on our species, not to just roll over and die, not to kill ourselves with drugs, not to impoverish ourselves, not to become pessimistic and depressed. We have a responsibility to join arm in arm with our brothers and sisters, the proletariat, the last class in all history, to push humanity toward a higher plane. And that is our message. So I thank you all for enjoying my broadcast tonight. Now we can do names and locations. Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. And then after that, I'll start answering super chat questions. Names and locations. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. Who's with us tonight? Names and locations. Who's with us? Who is with us? Folks, I'll mention this now. You know, I really would appreciate if you would sign up on Patreon. I really would appreciate it. That's the link for the Patreon. We need all the support we can get in our work. So there we go. All right. All righty. So now I'm going to start. All right. So we've got Keaton in Virginia. We've got Micah in Las Vegas. We got Tara Reed. Shout out to Tara Reed. We've got Christian from Bergen County. We got St. David's, Bermuda. We got North Carolina, Dust James. We got Mo in Toronto. We got Don D in NYC. We got Ryan in Oakland. We got Rice from Adelaide, Australia. We got JT24 in Mississippi. We got Tara Hoot, Charles Rogers, John McCarthy in Chicago, David in Bendigo, Australia, Sue from Rhode Island, Mike in North Carolina, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Ohio, San Miguel de Allende in Mexico. We got who else do we got here? We got Sue from Rhode Island, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati. We got Pacific Coats. We got Marissa from Washington State. We got Neil Frazier in Hong Kong, Michael in Ithaca, New York, Isaac from Vancouver, Ben in Illinois, Sam in Australia. We've got Tara Reed in the coast, Jeff in Delaware, Mo and Danielle in Pomona, California, Carmen in Reading, Pennsylvania. We've got DLJ in Malaysia. We've got John in West Denver. We got Ishmael in Los Angeles. We got Dan Harris in North Carolina, Jeremy in Springfield, Mohsin from Iran, Scott and Angie in Miami, Alex in Rochester, Adam in Salt Lake City. We got Joe in New Jersey. We got JR. We got JR in Kalamazoo. We got Tim in La Junta. We got Ivan in Hanoi, Jose in Newburgh. Big up to the anti-imperialists. Shout out to you. We got Lynn in South Florida, Talent, Oregon. We got Theo in Colorado, Patrick in Florida, Dave in Sacramento, Joe in Oklahoma City, Mark from California, Kieran from San Diego, Nathaniel from Washington State, St. Louis, Greg in Hong Kong, China. We've got Steve in Chattanooga. We've got Tokyo, Japan, Giovanni. We got Ben in Grand Junction, Gina, Arkansas, Marlon in San Diego, Zer in Denmark. We've got Chase in Brazoria County, Texas, Randy in Oregon. Good stuff. Steve in Chattanooga, Greg in Hong Kong, Bradley Wasser in St. Louis. Great stuff, folks. Cleveland Pirate Alex. We got Roscoe Dash in New Jersey. We got, Ben in Grand Junction. This is great, folks. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. If you'd like to join our Patreon community, that would be awesome. I'm dropping the link in there. We need all the support we can get. These are rough times, a lot of unpredictable stuff on the horizon. So we can always appreciate any of the help you can throw our way. Always appreciated. I'm seeing, I'm seeing other people. There we go. There we go. All right, folks. We got Jake in Red Hook. We got Bob in Troy, New York. Very good. All right, I'm going to start answering your super chat questions, folks. First super chat question I received was about the movie Soylent Green. Spoiler alert, Soylent Green. It's a movie from the 1970s with Charlton Heston. It's about a futuristic society. In this futuristic society, there's too many people, and there's hunger, riots all the time, and there's some kind of authoritarian, totalitarian government that's spying on everybody, and people are devalued, and people have names of objects instead of names. Like, somebody who is like a librarian is called a book, and a prostitute or a woman who is, like a sex slave is called furniture. And basically, it ends the end of the movie. They find out that the food that everyone is eating, Tristan in Maryland, shout out to you, Tristan, and subscribe to his channel, Parasocialite, great YouTube channel. They find out at the end of the movie that Soylent Green, this weird greeny food that everyone's eating, is people. And Charlton Heston has this meltdown, right? Soylent Green is people. It's made out of people. Ah! And he just has this meltdown. Oh my God, we're eating people. Soylent Green is made out of people. Ah, ah, ah. And he has this crazy meltdown, and then the government drags him away or something like that. It's a new left kind of movie, right? It's obviously the target of the movie is corporate capitalism, right? It's this one corporation, the Soylent Corporation, that dominates everything and is trying to make money. But it's a lot of talk about pollution, a lot of talk about overpopulation. It's not a Marxist film, but it's lefty, right? It's, this evil totalitarian corporation rules the world. Human beings are devalued or reduced to financial calculation. It's like a lot of 70s fiction movie. It's got a leftist edge to it. Not Marxist. And it's pessimistic. It's very dark. It's not an optimistic film. It's one thing about these fiction films. They tend to be very, very dark. The two 70s sci-fi films that you can watch. There's two of them. And that one is the new left science fiction film at Heston. Green, where you find out food everyone's eating throughout the entire movie is made out of people. And there's a guy committing suicide. They encourage you to commit suicide. The government has this program to help people commit suicide. It's a very dark film. And when you commit suicide, they show you like a Disney movie of animals and birds and nature while you commit suicide. It's really, really a dark film. Very, very dark film. Very, very dark film. So that's the new left film, right? It's got some Marxist themes, people being reduced to objects, corporations devaluing people, selling, dead bodies as food, as the tendency of the fall of rate of profit, first world capitals diffuse it. All right. Okay. All right. Tendency of the falling rate profit. Can it be resolved by new labor aristocracy? All right. And that's the lefty film. It's the lefty science fiction film of Charlton Heston in the 70s. The right-wing film by Charlton Heston in the 70s that I also think is worth mentioning. The right-wing sci-fi film that Charlton Heston made called The Omega Man. It's Omega Man. Both are entertaining films. They're just both very dark. And they're both very pessimistic. And a couple years before he made Soylent Green, 5-6 years before he made Soylent Green, during the Nixon administration, Charlton Heston made this movie, and it was his version. It was the Charlton Heston. It was the 70s version. It made it into a movie many times. There was a novel published called The Last Man on Earth. It was a 1950s novel about a nuclear war happens, and almost all of humanity is dead. But the people that are still around are all vampires. The nuclear fallout turns people into vampires, and is not a vampire who's on the planet. I think Will Smith made a version of this movie. I think Vincent Price made a version of it. The one starring Charlton Heston, the Omega Man. It's not The Last Man on Earth. It's the Omega Man, right? That one, the Charlton Heston one, that one is very political because Charlton Heston is to be a middle American conservative. And the opening scene of the movie is that, before the nuclear war, when everyone died, the movie theater was showing the Woodstock movie. And so every day during the daylight before the vampires come out, Charlton Heston's character goes to the movies and watches Woodstock. And he watches the Woodstock movie. And he sits there grimacing, hating the hippies, these damn hippies. I hate them. And he's sitting there, and he's supposed to be like a right-wing middle American. He's got his guns, and he's got his like fortress the vampires can't get into at night. And he's sitting there, and he's like this raging middle American conservative man. The hippies have ruined everything, and there was a nuclear war. It was all because of the hippies, something like that. So then the other thing is that character, Charlton Heston's character is not just this right-wing guy who hates hippies. The vampires are not just vampires. There's some kind of weird religious cult, right? The vampires are led by a guy named Matthias, who preaches that technology is evil, right? And that they hate science, right? And they hate technology, right? And Matthias is like their religious leader, their prophet. He's like the prophet of the vampires and hates technology. And so he leads the vampires to go around rioting and smashing technology. So it's clear that the vampires are supposed to be the new left. They're supposed to be the hippies, right? Charlton Heston is supposed to be your conservative middle American. And then how do they eventually get, spoiler alert, how do they eventually get Charlton Heston out? Well, there's a black woman who is a vampire, but she can come out during the day. And so he sees her, and he like finds the black woman who is a vampire, and she lures him out. And that probably loses sympathy for black people is the destruction of America. Fucking racist movie, right? I mean, it's, the hero is this right-wing dude who's got guns and hates hippies and has got a big fortress, and the bad people, the bad people are this weird group of, people, with robes and all of that, who break windows and don't believe in technology and are always rioting. And the way to finally destroy, the hero is he has sympathy and falls in love with a black woman, basically. And so it's supposed to indicate that, I mean, it's some really right-wing shit. So yeah, if you want to see like the new left Malthusian film, go see Soylent Green. Go get Soylent Green. If you want to see the right wing sci-fi film that Charlton Heston made, go see The Omega Man. But there you go. George A. Romero's movies such as Dawn of the Dead. All right, we'll talk about that. George A. Romero, Dawn of the Dead. But yeah, we'll talk about that. But yeah, that's basically, those are two of the movies from that period. And they're both reflecting, it's, Charlton Heston is middle America reacting to the hippies in The Omega Man. And, I think Charlton Heston is kind of fall apart and in Soylent Green. So there you go. All right. Russia is China's junior partner. I don't like that, right? I don't think one country is junior to the other. I don't think that one country is superior to the other. Russia has an amazing history defeating fascism, inventing space travel, raising its people up out of poverty, standing with African countries in their struggle against colonialism. China has an amazing history, also breaking shackles of imperialism. But even before that, going back 5,000 years as a rich civilization that was subject to humiliation at the hands of the British Empire, but broke free, that has done amazing things. The world's largest hydroelectric power plant, leading producer of steel, leading producer of telecommunications, a great inspirer for the whole world, the Belt Initiative. So China's population is much larger than Russia's. That's true. China's economy point is much larger than Russia's. That's true. But I don't see one as superior to the other. And I don't like the way you framed that question. One is a junior partner. Russia is a leading energy producer, and China needs Russian oil and gas. Their economy would come to a grinding halt in China if they didn't have that Russian oil and gas. Meanwhile, Russia imports a lot of Chinese products and does a lot of business with China. So I don't view one as superior to the other. And I don't think that's a correct way to frame, right? And again, I don't like when one country is putting down another country and saying, well, you're the junior partner, I'm the superior one. I don't like that. I don't think again, people are always flags at the Center for Political Innovation that we're advocates of American chauvinism. We are not, right? I don't think one country is superior to another. I don't like this thing. I heard my whole life people go around, this is the greatest country in the world. Well, greatest country in the world. You mean you don't think America's the greatest country in the world? You must be brainwashed by communists because clearly America's the greatest country in the world. Like, but how is it the greatest country in the world? I mean, are you saying we have the most wealth? Are you saying we have the most freedom? It is. It is. It's the greatest country in the world. And if you don't think that, you must be a communist. You must be a traitor. You must be brainwashed because everybody knows that the United States is the greatest country in the world. I mean, I hate that shit, right? I am loyal to the United States. I'm a patriot. I want a better life for the country. I think that socialism and breaking out of imperialism is good for American working families, but I'm not a chauvinist. I don't go around saying that America is the number one. I don't go around doing that. I don't do that, right? And I don't think any other country should do that either, right? I mean, if Russia was going around saying we're the greatest country in the world, all other countries are inferior to Russia, I'd be against that. China was going around saying we're number one, all other countries are inferior to China, I'd be against that. Not the right attitude. One should be loyal to one's homeland. There is no contradiction between patriotism and internationalism. If you really love your country, you should want it to get along with other countries in a rational international system where countries trade with each other on the basis of win-win cooperation. If you're really an internationalist, you should love your homeland, right? You should not want your homeland to be left behind as the world moves toward a higher plane of existence. So, yes, there is no contradiction between patriotism and internationalism. Tiananmen Square incident. Well, first of all, for the person who asked that super chat, we need to clarify because there are two incidents. In 1976, had the famous Tiananmen incident in 1976, not as famous as what happened in 89. 1976, Zhou Enlai died. And at Zhou Enlai's funeral, a lot of the young intellectuals and engineers and scientists who felt threatened by the Gang of Four and had turned to Zhou Enlai for protection rioted, and Zhou Enlai's funeral turned into an anti-communist riot, and it was referred to as the Tiananmen incident in 1976. And it was a sign that China had to stop the Cultural Revolution. That if the Cultural Revolution did not end, the Communist Party would be overthrown. That's what the Tiananmen incident in 1976 was. I assume Christian's referring to the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989, and that incident and I actually wrote, I don't know if it'll let me post it. I wrote it for a website, but I think they might let me post the Greenville Post version of it. I'm going to post a long article I wrote about it. I wrote an article called Tiananmen, Trump, and the American Psyche. I wrote this article because it needs to be written because we can't go over the facts too much. I'm actually just going to pull up the article to make sure that yeah, let's see if this goes through. I don't think it's going to go through. I wrote it for New Eastern Outlook magazine. It's a magazine, a webzine from Russia, and they are generally blocked on any like Facebook or YouTube. Let's see if it goes through, though. I want to see if it goes through the original version of the article. Did that go through? Oh, it went through on YouTube. It went through on YouTube. So there you go. It didn't go through on Facebook, but it went through on YouTube. And on Facebook, it says, New Eastern Outlook, your content couldn't be shared because this link goes against community standards. Why? The Russian Academy of Social Sciences. Unbelievable. But yes, that's my article, Tiananmen, Trump, and the American Psyche, where I document all of this with citations and all of this. And I've talked about it many times. All right, Tiananmen, 1989. So you have to remember that, China is at a turning point in 1989. 1989 is at a turning point. The Deng Xiaoping market reforms are on their way. The reform and opening up is happening. And there's a lot of confusion in China. And there's a lot of people in China who think, oh, this is a betrayal of communism. Also, a lot of people in China who say, oh, this is proof we should have full-on capitalism. There's a lot of confusion. And you have to also remember that across Eastern Europe, you have Solidarność, this anti-communist movement, this dock workers strike in Poland that's being led by the CIA. You have, leading up to 1989 is a lot of communist governments throughout Eastern Europe fall. And in China, there's a protest movement of in the summer protest movement. That's when it got a huge amount of international attention. It didn't start then. Started in January, February, March on college campuses all throughout China. There are riots. US media, there's like one or two articles about it in the New York Times. No one really talks about it. What were the riots on the college campuses that led up to the Tiananmen Square incident of 1989 really about? Look it up. Don't believe me. Read the New York Times. I cite in my article, there is a hyperlink to an article by Nicholas Kristof. Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times pointed out that one of the primary motivations, January of 1989, Chinese universities, starting in January of that year, Chinese universities were swept with protests against the presence of African students. Yeah. The Tiananmen Square protest movement started as a protest against black people being at Chinese colleges. That's how it started. It started out with Chinese students who were mad at the Chinese government and said, why are they wasting our money bringing all these black people to China and giving them an education? They should be spending their money on us, not wasting our money on these black people. And it started because there were rumors that some of these African students at universities in China had been dating local women. And the Chinese were outraged. A lot of these very racist, conservative, aged that Chinese women were dating black people, Africans. That's how it started. The Tiananmen Square protest movement started as a racist movement against the presence of black people on Chinese campuses. And no one ever talks about it. But if you don't believe me, I cite the New York Times. There is an article from the New York Times that says this. I did not say it. The New York Times says it. That's a Nicholas Kristof article in the New York Times. Makes that clear. That is my source, right? New York Times, 1989, January 5th, Nicholas Kristof, Africans in Beijing boycott classes. And you can read the article for yourself. On Tuesday, about 2,000 Chinese students at the Beijing Language Institute boycotted classes and held a march to protest what they said were attacks on Chinese women by African men. The African students said they did not dare hold a demonstration in the current tense atmosphere, that they would continue to boycott classes until the police released their... You look at it. I'm going to drop the hyperlink here to the New York Times. The Tiananmen Square protest movement in 1989 started out as race riots at Chinese colleges against the presence of black people. That is a fact. January 5th, 1989, New York Times, Nicholas Kristof reported that all over China, there were race riots happening on the campus against the presence of black people. Nobody ever talks about this. Oh, no, those students at Tiananmen Square were all a bunch of kumbaya hippies. No, they weren't. One of the big issues they were mad about was black people going to college, and some of them, God forbid, dating Chinese women. So that's one of the first things that you want to point out about the Tiananmen protest movement. This is one of the first things that no one ever talks about. Second thing about the Tiananmen Square protest movement, right? And this is very fascinating. Again, this is not something that ever gets talked about, but this is according to a book published by Harvard University, Tiananmen Moon, Inside the Student Uprising in 1989. Quote, the book says there were more pictures of Mao Zedong in Tiananmen Square in 1989 than there had ever been during the Cultural Revolution. The book quotes someone on May 18th of 1989 in Tiananmen Square saying, it's like a second cultural revolution. There were a number of Tiananmen Square protesters who weren't racist. They weren't mad that there were black people going to college in China. They were also mad that they wanted to go back to hardline communism. They wanted to go back to the Mao era. They wanted to go back to Maoism. There were big pictures of Mao all over the square. So many pictures of Mao that it looked like a second cultural revolution. And that's according to a Harvard University published book, that there were huge pictures of Mao all over Tiananmen Square. That is fact. So you were told that the students in Tiananmen Square just wanted American democracy and freedom. Some of them wanted to get rid of black people and were racist. hardline tank communists, right? And they were basically neo-Maoists, ultra-lefts. So that doesn't fit what you've been told about the Tiananmen Square incident. Now, another thing that you were also not told about the Tiananmen Square incident, and again, this is according to a number of people. A number of sources have come forward and said this, right? The immediate aftermath of the Tiananmen massacre. This is what Nicholas Kristof, New York Times reporter, said. Quote, based on my observations in the streets, neither the official account nor many of the foreign versions are quite correct. There was no massacre in Tiananmen Square, for example, although there was plenty of killing elsewhere. That's Nicholas Kristof. But he's not the only person to say that. 2009, James Miles, a reporter for the BBC, he said roughly the same thing. He said, quote, there was no massacre on Tiananmen Square. Protesters were still in the square when the army reached it, and they were allowed to leave after negotiations with martial law. So that's two people, two eyewitnesses, one from the New York Times and one from the BBC, who says there was no massacre in Tiananmen Square. Third thing, WikiLeaks. This is the smoking gun. WikiLeaks released a cable, a diplomatic cable, sent by the representative of Chile when Pinochet was in power. Not a communist. The representative of Pinochet's Chile was not a communist. But this is what the diplomat in Pinochet's Chile, this is what he said in the WikiLeaks leaked diplomatic cable. Quote, once an agreement was reached with the students for withdrawing, linking hands to form a column, the students left the square through the southeast corner. The Tiananmen Square protests in 1989 ended peacefully. We have three different eyewitnesses that said the protests ended peacefully. The square was cleared peacefully. The students marched out the southwest corner. They had a negotiation with the martial law. There was a lot of killing elsewhere, which I'll get to. But the actual occupation of the square that had gone on for weeks and weeks and weeks finally ended peacefully. They didn't just run all those people over. What about all the people who died, Caleb? Aha! The people who died elsewhere. Right? This is the Washington Post. I'm reading to you a quote from the Washington Post. This is the Washington Post. Quote, well, it's not a quote, but this is the Washington Post describes 12 to 2, I'm sorry. The Washington Post described an organized group of 100 to 150 people armed with chains, Molotov cocktails, and clubs who were carefully organized into squads of 5. Cars and public buses were torched and gunfire was exchanged between the military and other forces. Between 12 and 200 Chinese soldiers were killed after the square was peacefully cleared. Among those who was killed was Private Zhang Liji, who was shot by gunfire from within the apartments where foreign diplomats were living. In the apartment buildings where all the American diplomats were living, there was snipers on the roof shooting Chinese soldiers down. Meanwhile, another soldier, Q Guizong, I'm just butchering this. I don't speak Chinese. Forgive me, Chinese speakers. I apologize. He was stabbed to death on a pedestrian bridge. He was walking across the bridge, and somebody stabbed him to death. Again, not peaceful, right? Furthermore, 6 People's Liberation Army soldiers died when their truck was flipped over and caught on fire. So as many as almost 200 Chinese soldiers died. If there are 200 people who die on the other side, it's not a massacre, folks. It's a battle. That is called a battle. Right? So there's snipers on rooftops shooting down Chinese soldiers. There's people flipping over their cars and lighting them on fire. There's people stabbing people to death, soldiers to death on a rooftop. And here's the most wild part. It was sections of the People's Liberation Army shooting other sections. There was a wing of the People's Liberation Army that came over to the side of the protesters. And so they brought in People's Liberation Army soldiers from outside of Beijing to put down the section of the military that had come over to their side. So there was basically some kind of coup attempt going on. If the military in Beijing is on one side and it's getting shot at by other members of the military, They describe widespread insubordination among the ranks. This was what happened was there was a peaceful protest movement in the square that went on for a while. And some of the people were there because they wanted human rights. Some of the people were there because they hated black people. And some of the people were there because they wanted hardline communism. And some of the people were there for who God knows what. This is what always happens in color revolutions. Everyone just gets the memo. Now is the time to go protest. And all kinds of different causes and all kinds of different movements are there for all kinds of different reasons. Trade unions were there. They built a statue that looked kind of like the Statue of Liberty. People were singing the Internationale. There's big pictures of Mao everywhere. There's people mad that black people are on the college. It was a circus. The square just became this big center of unrest. Then it appears that something happened, right? And Deng declared martial law. The square and the students peacefully dispersed. And after they peacefully dispersed, there was 2 weeks of violence and killing throughout Beijing. And people were being shot at, and people were being gunned down, and people were being lit on fire, and sections of the army were killing other people. And the whole thing was some kind of attempted coup. It was an attempted coup. They were trying to do what they did in Czechoslovakia, what they did in Poland, what they did in Romania, what they did and eventually did in the Soviet Union. They were trying to do in China in 1989. And it was awful. And a lot of people died who shouldn't have died, right? I'm sure that there were a lot of people who were caught in the crossfire, right? There were probably a lot of people who were caught in the crossfire and got killed. And it was awful. And I feel sorry for their families. And there were probably a lot of people who eventually got arrested just because they'd been part of the protest movement. And that's not good, right? People should ultimately, ideally, have the right to protest. But this narrative that we have, that I've heard my whole life, I heard this narrative. I was born in 1987. So this happened when I was 2 years old. My whole life, everyone has told me, oh my God, the Chinese government is so evil. They saw these peaceful protesters protesting, and they said, oh, these darn hippies, they're protesting against our system. And they said, rev up the tanks, boys, and rum, and they ran them all over with tanks. That didn't fucking happen. That's a lie. And it makes me mad. It makes me mad. That didn't happen. Okay? It was an awful massacre. It was an awful event. A lot of people died. But the idea, this narrative that we have in our head, that these were a bunch of hippies singing Kumbaya and they just wanted peace and freedom. The is like, run them over, rum, and run them over with tanks. That didn't happen. The Tank Man, the famous Tank Man photo, happened the next day after the square had already been cleared. The students were already out of there. And the square was then, at that point, after the students had cleared, they put the military out in the square because there was violence going on all over the city. The military was there. So this guy ran back into the square after the protests were already over and did his thing where he stood in front of it. That was not during the protests. The idea was, he refused to stand down. He stood there with his thing. No, false. That didn't happen. Did not happen. That's not what happened. The guy standing there was standing there after the square had already been cleared the next day. So what you believe, that story of the guy standing there, that didn't happen. That's not what happened. That was the next day after they already cleared the square. It's fake news. It's a lie. It's a lie. It's projection. It's a huge amount of projection. It's a huge amount of projection. Because the narrative that we all have in our head about what happened there, it comes from Forrest Gump. It comes from Rambo. It's some kind of demented 1980s reinterpretation of the 1960s. Right? I don't know if you've ever seen First Blood, Sylvester Stallone. It's a movie. And Sylvester Stallone is ranting against protesters. And he's like, I come back from Vietnam and these maggots are spitting on me. Who do they think they are? These traitors. I want to kill them all, these protesters. Communist Party was Rambo. So mad they killed them all. That's not what happened. Right? And on top of that, they think, basically, they're thinking about Haight-Ashbury. They're thinking about Berkeley. They're thinking about the Vietnam War. And here's the thing. what they accused the Chinese government of doing in 1989, which they didn't do, the students dispersed peacefully, the U.S. government actually did in 1970. May 4th, 1970, Kent State University. A bunch of students were having a peaceful protest. None of them had guns. A single one of them had a gun. Not a single one of them even had a weapon, right? There was somebody with a flag in the crowd. They were like 50 to 100 feet away, and the National Guard opened fire on them. 4 students were shot dead. That's what that happened in the United States. Yes, in the United States, the U.S. Armed Forces, the National Guard, opened fire and killed 4 students, put a number of other students in wheelchairs. There's people, I met people. I would go to Kent State every year when I was an activist in Ohio. I met people who couldn't move their hand because it had been shot by the National Guard. I mean, I met people. There were people that were in wheelchairs their whole life because they were shot by the National Guard. I mean, it was a massacre. 2 of the students that they killed weren't even protesters. They were hit by stray bullets. They were walking to class. 2 of them were at the protest. Allison Krauss and Jeffrey Miller. They were at the protest and they were murdered. They were shot dead. But after they massacred the students at Kent State University, after 4 students were gunned down, they interviewed. You can watch local if you don't believe me. They interviewed a lot of local people in Ohio. I'm from this area. I grew up 20 minutes away from Kent State University. They interviewed some local people about this, and they said they should have shot more of them. They should have killed them all. They were disrespecting the country. They were protesting the war. That's disrespect of America. You know what I mean? They thought they should have shot all of them. And in fact, from what I understand, a lot of the local residents of Kent who did not like the college kids started greeting each other with 4 fingers. 4. We got 4. Like we killed 4 of them. Like it was a celebration. Right? And I mean, it's unbelievable. In the little town that I lived in, this is a wild story, right? Because I'm from a little town in Ohio. Every year I would hear, and I'm born in 87. So I was born like 20 years after this happened. Every year around the time of Kent State, I would hear the old people start talking about, oh, they say it was a massacre, but those kids were disrespecting America. They were disrespecting our troops. Oh, they deserve to die. I mean, it was unbelievable. My teachers told me they were America. They were violent protesters. My whole life that they deserved to die. They deserved to get killed. I heard this, right? I heard this my whole life that they deserved to die. And a wild story. I even heard this story. This blows my mind. There was a guy in my town. Who went to Kent State University. He wasn't a protester. He just went there. He just went to the college. And when he came home, they shut down the college after the massacre, right? They shut down the college. When he came home to his house, people had thrown bricks through his windows because they found out he'd gone to Kent State and they were so mad about the massacre. And just because he went there, just because he went to Kent State University, they threw bricks through his windows. That is shocking to me. That is utterly shocking to me. I mean, it's just like, at the time that the Kent State Massacre happened, and so, what actually happened in Kent, Ohio is what didn't happen in Tiananmen. In Tiananmen, they didn't send the army in to gun down all the peaceful protesters. Instead, the army negotiated with them and they surrendered and they left peace. And then after they left peacefully, people were on rooftops shooting at them, and people were setting things on fire, and there were sections of the army shooting at other people. And it was violence in the streets with deaths on both sides. It was a battle. There was 2 weeks of like battle and low intensity warfare on the streets of Beijing afterwards. So everything you thought you knew about the Tiananmen massacre is a lie, right? And it makes me mad. I'm sorry I'm getting fired up on here, but it makes me really, really angry the way that they lie. The U.S. government lies all the time. All the time. I mean, I'm telling you, okay. I mean, I guess maybe, I'm sure, if Destiny Bonnell or one of the bread tubers were on here, they would insist that Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times, that James Miles of the BBC, and the representative, the diplomat from Chile, from Pinochet's Chile, whose cable was leaked by WikiLeaks, all of them are part of some communist conspiracy to make the Chinese government look good. Give me a break. Give me a break. CIA evidence. It was all over Western media. CNN was talking about it every day. it was clearly, it was the format of a color revolution. They were trying to use those events to destabilize China. And Jackson State. Don Deering is talking about Jackson State, very famous incident of like I think that would be 11 days later in 1970. 11 days later, there were a group of African American college students who were protesting at Jackson State, and the local police showed up and shot two of them. And there was two of them were gunned down by the local police. That happened at Jackson State in Mississippi. Thank you, Don, for pointing that out, right? So Kent State Massacre was May 4th, 1970. May 5th, 1970, you had the massacre at Jackson State, where, African-American college kids were protesting and the local police shot them, right? So again, and there were a number of incidents. There was a young guy named James Rector, who was protesting in Berkeley. He was protesting the Vietnam War. He was part of the People's Park uprising, where the Vietnam War protesters seized control of a park in Berkeley. It's called People's Park. And the police shot him and killed him, shot him dead. He was killed. James Rector. Google James Rector. You don't believe me? Well, Google it right now. James Rector. James Rector. Berkeley. It happened. James Rector. Right? James Rector was killed at Berkeley, right? People's Park. People's Park. It's on the Wikipedia page for People's Park in Berkeley. Casualties, right? Find Berkeley. Rector. Right? The local Southside neighborhood was the scene of a major confrontation between protesters and police in May of 1969. A mural near the park, painted by artist O'Brien Thiel and lawyer Asha Newman, depicts the shooting of James Rector, who was fatally shot on May 15th, 1969. Yeah, James Rector. James Rector was killed, right? So Alameda County Sheriff's deputies used shotguns to fire at people sitting on the roof of the cinema. James Rector was visiting friends in Berkeley and watching from the roof of the Grandma Books when he was shot by police. He died on May 19th. The Alameda County reported the cause of death as shock and hemorrhage due to multiple shotgun wounds. Governor Reagan conceded that Rector was probably shot by police, but justified the bearing of firearms, saying it's naive to assume that you should send anyone into a conflict with a fly swatter. He's got to have an appropriate weapon. The University of California Police Department said Rector threw a steel rebar down at the police. However, Time magazine claimed that Rector was a bystander and not a protester. Wow. Yeah, so this guy was sitting on the roof watching the protesters fight, with the police. And for whatever reason, they say he threw a bar, but then that's not confirmed. But supposedly a bar was thrown or something. So then the police, they took their shotgun and blew him away, right? That happened in the United States of America, right? People's Park. But there's many other incidents, right? I believe there was a protest. There was a civil rights march in the mid 60s. There was a civil rights march that was opened fire on. I'm trying to remember where it was. I think it was in South Carolina. It was either South Carolina or North Carolina. There was a picket line of civil rights activists, African Americans, and the local police just showed up and blew everybody away, right? What they accused the Chinese government of doing, they themselves did over and over and over again. And then their whole narrative about how it supposedly happened has nothing to do. China is not America. China's not America. It wasn't the Vietnam War era. There wasn't a pro movement going on. There weren't hippies out there singing kumbaya. There wasn't, Charlton Heston out there going, these damn hippies disrespecting our home. That's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. That's not what happened. Okay? And China is a completely different country than America, with a completely different history than the United States of America. Completely different history, completely different culture. These people have no idea what they're talking about. Fred Hampton, yeah, that's great. I mean, that was a little bit different. That was like a straight up assassination. He was in his bed and they gunned him down. And if you look at what happened in Tiananmen, I mean, they did crack down. The students dispersed peacefully, and then there was a gun battle. It wasn't, it just makes me mad. I'm sorry. Sorry I'm going on about this, Christian, but it's a good question because I've heard this my whole life, and it makes me mad to learn that I was lied to so blatantly. So blatantly. The narrative of the Tiananmen events that I've heard, that we've all heard our whole lives, is not true. All right, next question. Why are the new Black Panthers not Marxists? Well, the new Black Panther Party, my understanding is it was started by Dr. Khalid Muhammad. Dr. Khalid Muhammad, he was a leader of the Nation of Islam. He was a kind of, he was like lower tier. He was like under Minister Louis Farrakhan. And he started making comments about different issues, comments that were considered to be anti-Semitic. And the Nation of Islam felt he was not representing them properly. So they removed him from the Nation of Islam. So he then started the new Black Panther Party. And with him, he had Malik Zulu Shabazz, who was a leader of the Nation of Islam, who was actually the leader of the Million Youth March. In the late 90s, the Nation of Islam convened the Million Youth March in Harlem. And it was basically a march against racial profiling. It was thousands and thousands of Black people in the streets led by the Nation of Islam. The leader of it was Malik Zulu Shabazz. Now, Dr. Khalid Muhammad died, and Malik Zulu Shabazz, I believe he is currently the leader of the new Black Panther Party, if I'm not mistaken. But the new Black Panther Party it was started by members of the Nation of Islam and former members of the Nation of Islam. But they have no religious affiliation. Some of them are Christian, some of them are communist, some of them are atheist. They've opened it to former members of the original Black Panther Party. And actually, when I was in Cleveland, I attended the new Black Panther Party summit at Cleveland State University. And in Cleveland, the leader of the new Black Panther Party was Abdul Kahar. And Abdul Kahar was actually a former political prisoner. He was a member of the Louisville Seven, and he had done time in prison before ultimately being freed. He was acquitted. Eventually, evidence, he got a new trial. He was acquitted, but he was one of the Louisville Seven. And he was, Abdul Kahar was an amazing man. I mean, to meet him, he was an amazing person. He was an amazing speaker. He was a Black revolutionary. Abdul Kahar was just an amazing man. And I asked him many times about that. And he insisted that, yes, he was a Muslim. He'd converted to Islam when he was in prison, but many people in the new Black Panther Party weren't each. And he actually had a fact sheet, an official fact sheet from the new Black Panther Party. And it said like facts and myths, like, the new Black Panther Party is Muslim. He says, no, we have no religious test. You can even be an atheist and be in it. And then one of them was the new Black Panther Party is socialist or communist. He said, we have no political affiliation. We just fight for our program of Black liberation. My understanding is that Malik Zulu Shabazz, he believes that, if I'm not mistaken, he believes that Africa, he basically argues that communism is African, and that Karl Marx plagiarized communist ideas from African scholars. I don't know what he bases that on, but I respect his right to say that as a Black man and as a Black nationalist. So he rejects Marxism, arguing that Marxism is plagiarized from African thinkers. That's my understanding. I met Malik Zulu Shabazz. I've met him several times, when I was covering Black Lives Matter protests and such. And some of his appearances on Fox News were pretty awesome. Some of them were pretty amazing. I wonder, I mean, some of them were pretty awesome. Some of the times that he appeared on Fox News were amazing. And for a while during the Obama years, they started having the new Black Panther Party on Fox News because it would scare the crap out of their viewers. It's kind of like what Fox News used to like to do, right? They'd have real left-wing voices on there just as kind of to scare the audience, to scare the right-wing audience. Let's see if I can find, there's a clip of the new Black Panthers on Hannity and Combs that was really awesome. And I might actually just show it on here if I can. New Black Panthers, Hannity, because it is the best comeback I've ever seen. If I can find the clip, if I can actually find the clip of this interaction, because it was really awesome. It's pretty old. It was a long time ago, but it was a great clip. If I can show it, if I can find it here, if I can find this clip, it wasn't Malik Zulu Shabazz. It was somebody else from the new Black Panther Party. Just had the best comeback ever. It was really just the best the best comeback ever that I've ever seen. And I'm trying to, if I can see if I can find this clip. It was one of the most awesome comebacks I've ever seen. I don't think I can find it. I don't. It's not coming up. They ruined the YouTube search mechanism. So I'm trying to find this clip for y'all, but I don't think I can find it. Unfortunately. But it was a very funny clip of the new Black Panther Party on Fox News back in the day, and it was really, I mean, I just whoever this guy was who was with him, it wasn't Malik Zulu Shabazz. He had the best comeback I've ever heard. I mean, I don't want to ruin it. I don't want to ruin it, but if I can find a clip, I'll show it. But um, yeah, it was brilliant. It was brilliant. If I can find it, but yeah, they've ruined the YouTube search mechanism. Very annoying. Very, very, very annoying. So they've ruined the YouTube search mechanism, and I don't think I'm going to be able to find this clip for you all. But there you go. One person that I also had the honor of meeting was Elaine Brown, and Elaine Brown was the first female chair. Kemal Ataturk's impact on Turkey. All right. Kemal impact on Turkey. All right. And you know, the what was it? The anyhow, Elaine Brown, she was the first female chair of the Black Panthers, of the original Black Panthers. And she kind of had dedicated herself to fighting against mass incarceration. And I remember she came to Cleveland to give a talk in support of some political prisoners I was supporting. And she's awesome. She is amazing. I mean, she's got a sense of humor that is brilliant, and she can give a very good speech, and she's very entertaining. And being around Elaine Brown was certainly fun. I'll tell you that much. She is certainly a very good orator, and I think she and the new Black Panther Party are on bad terms, unfortunately. But there you go. All right, next question. Hopefully, I can find that clip of the new Black Panthers for you all. I can show it maybe on a future stream, because it was really the best comeback I've ever seen on a live TV. I died laughing. I thought it was the best comeback ever. All right. Is Euro communism a psyop? The Japanese Communist Party is anti-Putin. Euro communism, the term Euro communism, a lot of people don't know what it means, but in 1978, there was a declaration from the Italian Communist Party and the Spanish Communist Party and the French Communist Party, and they all denounced the Soviet Union. They all declared that the Soviet Union, they denounced the Soviet Union's foreign policy. They denounced the Soviet Union on a number of points, human rights, etc. And that was big because the French Communist Party was a huge party with millions of members. The Italian Communist Party was a huge party with millions of members. The Spanish Communist Party had been an underground organization under Franco. After the fall of Franco, they were newly legal. They were part of the Spanish government, and then they also denounced the Soviet Union. And immediately, Zbigniew Brzezinski embraced them. And he was, the Carter administration was in office. And they said, yes, we need to work with the Euro communists against the Soviet communists. And it was Zbigniew Brzezinski who apparently coined the term Euro communism. And Euro communism was basically these huge communist parties in Europe that had deep roots, cutting off their ties to the Soviet Union and becoming basically social democratic reformist parties. And they were already kind of that already, right? A lot of these parties were not, you read some of their manifestos, they were very much conciliatory, but cutting it off with the Soviet Union was a big deal, right? And when Eurocommunism happened, it was largely the result of covert efforts by the United States. In a lot of ways, this was a result of the Frankfurt School and the Ford Foundation and the International Gramsci Society and a lot of institutions basically propping up Marxist academics, because these parties were dominated by intellectuals. Althusser was this this leader of the French Communist Party, was a philosophy professor. And the Italian Communist Party, you had Gramsci's writings were being published and circulated by academia. Antonio Gramsci, a leader of the Italian Communist Party, had been jailed by Mussolini. His prison notebooks had been published and circulated. And the Frankfurt School in Germany became, was this Marxist institute with Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and others. And there was covert funding of Marxist academics. And the kind of liberal synthetic left politics that was being covertly funded in the universities, where college professors were getting grant money to write books about Marxism, but do it in a certain way where it was a cultural critique. It wasn't about class struggle. That's where Eurocommunism came from. That communism, the communist movement was corrupted by grant money and by academic funding. And that's what ultimately led to a situation where, again, the discourse in these parties was dominated by college professors who were putting out an anti-communist message. They were into French existentialism. They were into, the Frankfurt School. They were into the culture struggle, and they were becoming more and more opposed to the Soviet Union. And if you follow, a lot of people are into philosophy. They follow how, what's his name? Michel Foucault eventually became a libertarian and an advocate of free trade, started out as a Marxist, and Jean-Paul Sartre, and this whole history of these intellectuals who are being covertly backed by the United States, their message became less and less Marxist, and the parties that they were part of, these huge political institutions, became less and less revolutionary. That's where Eurocommunism came from. I don't know if PSYOP is the right word, but it's the result of covert infiltration of left-wing politics, that's for sure. All right. Now, it was said that Left Forum said there was an environmental event sponsored by ExxonMobil. Well, you have to remember, and this is a lot of people don't get this, right? Why would ExxonMobil sponsor an environmental event? They're an oil company. There's a reason. There is a reason, folks. Environmental laws are very beneficial to some oil companies because they get to write them. If you're a huge oil company, there are 4 super major oil companies: ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. There's 4 of them. Those 4 companies, they function like a cartel. And they are huge. And if there's going to be a new environmental law written, they've got Congress in their pocket. They've got the White House in their pocket. They're going to write it. And they can write it in a way that they get to do what they want to do. But their competitors, like the fracking companies, like the deep sea drillers, like the little oil companies, like their competitors don't. And that is often why money from big oil will fund environmental activism. Big oil wants to write the laws so it has no competitors. And big oil also wants there to be scarcity of oil. The less oil there is in the world, the higher the price goes up. Supply and demand, folks. So this idea that all oil companies are just completely anti-environmental is way too simplistic. Way too simplistic. If you're an oil company and you've got huge, these 4 companies, if you throw in the French company total, I believe that makes up like 80% of oil production in the world. All right. This is huge, right? The oil fields of Nigeria are run by these people. The Middle Eastern oil, the Saudi oil fields. It's all these people. Anywhere there's like a U.S.-aligned country that's got oil, these 4 companies run it. And these people, they've got so much more than everybody else. They will often sponsor. They want new environmental laws because they will get to write them. And they can use it to put their competitors out of business. And they can use it to create more scarcity, which will drive the price up. That's what's going on with the war in Ukraine right now. The war in Ukraine has driven the oil prices up like crazy. Price of gas is higher than ever. That means more profits for them. It means the oil that they have is more valuable because there's less on the market. When you reduce the amount of a valued commodity, the price of it goes up. The less gold there is, the more gold costs. The more gold there is, the less gold costs. That's how these things work. All righty. All right. The crisis after 2009 and 2016. I don't know what the person is talking about. There was a financial meltdown in 2009, and in 2016, Donald Trump got elected. And I don't know. What does that mean? There wasn't a big economic fallout in 2016. The economy was kind of okay in 2016. So I don't know what that is. I don't know what the person's getting at. Why do so many people think socialism is stoicism? Well, the capitalists have done a very, very good job of convincing people that capitalism is money. Do you like having money, or do you want to be poor? Well, if you like having money, you love capitalism. And if you like being poor, you're a socialist. Well, that's bullshit. But that's what a lot of people think. And look, I mean, if I wanted to have money, and if I really believed that, that socialism was not having money and capitalism was having money, I would be a capitalist, because life tends to be easier when you have money than if you don't. And there's a lot of middle class people who will say, "Oh, but life is about material things." Okay, tell somebody who's living in a trailer, tell someone who grew up in poverty, tell someone who went to bed hungry that, "Oh, you should not be attached." I mean, there's this middle class detachment from reality. But for people who have struggled to have money in their life, and if you go to them and say, "My ideology is that you should not have money, you should be poor," they're going to say, "Screw you," and they're not going to be interested in your ideology. Right? Now, middle class people that are looking for enlightenment and are looking for some kind of spiritual thing, that's a whole nother thing. But people that are struggling to get by and are increasingly impoverished, if you present your ideology as being, "We want you to be poor and poorer, we want to increase your amount of poverty because having stuff is like capitalist, man," people are going to generally be hostile to it. So that's the great thing the capitalists have done, right? Donald Trump, long before he was president, he wrote a book. He said, "I want everyone to be rich because then you can buy my products." The capitalists have done a very good job convincing people that capitalism means having lots of stuff, means having money, and people generally want more wealth than they already have. And so it's the most brilliant brainwash. And Marxists have got to stand up against this. And we've got to say, no, capitalism is about creating poverty. Capitalism is a system where the more wealth is produced, the poorer people get. And that our goal is a society where the means of production are rationally planned. I talked about that last night for a very long time. So go look that up. Go look it up. Last night's stream, I did a whole thing about that. Sorry, gentle laborer, but I mean, I just don't want to repeat myself. But this is a brilliant psyop the capitalists have done. And that if you own money, you're a capitalist. If you have a house, do you have a house? Oh, well, the communism is about abolishing private property. They want to take your house. Do you have a car? Did you spend years, saving up to buy a nice car? Well, communism is getting rid of your private property. The government wants to come take your car. This is the psyop the capitalists have done. And it doesn't like that. Are tech workers in Silicon Valley liberal? Are tech workers and it's brilliant. It's brilliant propaganda. And the new left that is anti-growth plays right into it. And we have to stand against this. That's why I wrote a book called Getting Rich Without Capitalism. Working people are being impoverished. And that's why the capitalists are trying to tell people, "Oh, communism is about making you poorer. This is communism." And if we don't stand up against this and we don't break with the new left narrative, it's like, yes, wealth is bad. We have to break with the synthetic left. It has nothing to do with Marxism. You think that William Z. Foster led workers to go on strike so they could get paid less? Do you think that Eugene Debs and Gus Hall and Huey Newton and A. Philip Randolph led workers out on strike so they could get paid less? You don't build movements of working people on the basis of having less. You might build movements of hippies, like doing some spiritual thing, man. But that's not Marxism. Marxism is not Stoicism. Next question. All right. The tendency for the falling rate of profit. All right. Now, I'm trying to, usually when I explain the tendency of the falling rate of profit, I have like a notebook and I draw the numbers and I explain it. I'll just quickly go over it. All right. The capitalist is constantly trying to replace human labor with machines, right? They want to reduce the role of the person in production, replace people with machines. The problem is people do not create machines do not create surplus value. Only people do. There's a set rate that you pay the machine. The value the machine puts into the product is the value you pay. The value the material puts into the product is the value you pay. But you can pay the worker and extract from the amount of value the worker puts into the product in order to get profit. Right? And that's how the capitalist makes profits. The only way the capitalist can make profit is by cutting into the value produced by the worker. Right? That's the only way it can be done. Right? The surplus value is only created by workers. So as you reduce the role of the worker in production, the rate of profit of surplus value that the capitalist can extract per commodity sold is decreasing by percentage. He might be producing more products, but the percentage of profit, the rate of profit that he's getting on each product, is constantly going down. And that's called the tendency of the falling rate of profit. And it exacerbates the problem of overproduction. It's something that goes on in a capitalist crisis. And no, I don't think you can resolve it by creating a new labor aristocracy, right? Again, the labor aristocracy wasn't created because the capitalists sat there and said, I know, we shall pay some workers high. No, it happened because there were unions among quote unquote skilled workers. There were unions among construction trades and stuff, but the capitalists were able to make concessions to them. And based on that, based on giving the concessions to those workers, those workers, it got to their head after a while. Great example of this, right? Again, people who deny the labor aristocracy just don't get it, right? Construction workers in in New York City. New York City is a great, in Manhattan, right? And it's not like it was. I mean, even here, I mean, the unions are much weaker, but Manhattan, you tend to have a strong hold of the construction workers unions. Those construction workers, union construction workers in New York City, they're making a good $100 an hour, okay? They are probably some of the highest paid construction workers in the world. Why? Why is that? Why is it that in New York City, you have the highest paid construction workers in the world? Well, some people will say, well, that's because they fought for it. They had a union and they fought for it. Well, that's true. They do have unions and they did fight for it. So I'm not going to deny that. And there were construction workers' strikes and there were construction workers who got killed on the picket line. And even today, there's militant construction workers. Yes. But if that's all it is, then that would mean that the construction workers in New York City are the most revolutionary construction workers in the world. Because clearly the construction workers in Mexico and the construction workers in Afghanistan just haven't fought hard enough for it. Well, that's bullshit. The reason that construction workers in New York City are able to make like $100 an hour is, yes, they have a union to fight for them, but also the capitalists here in New York City sit at the center of a global financial empire, and they're reaping in super profits from all across the planet. So they can, if the construction workers union goes on strike and they're reaping in billions of dollars from across the planet, they can say, all right, fine, we'll give you $100 an hour. Much easier than a boss in Afghanistan can say that. A boss in Afghanistan is not reaping in super profits from across the planet. And he's not sitting there going, maybe he can afford $100 an hour, but he's going to fight a lot harder against that union because he can't afford it, right? And this is what people don't get about the labor aristocracy. The labor aristocracy is the result of the fact that the capitalist corporations in the Western countries dominate the global economy, and they super exploit people all over the country. All over the world, they super exploit people. So in Manhattan, the capital of capitalism, you have the highest paid construction workers in the world because, again, yes, they did have to fight for it. They had to go on strike. And if they stopped having a union, they would immediately start driving their wages down and cheating them. That's true, but they're able to give it to them. But historically, those workers, those construction workers in New York City who make like $100 an hour, historically, during the Vietnam War, those guys were really right-wing. And they used to go beat the crap out of anti-war protesters. Google the hard hat riots of 1970, right? Those guys used to go around and beat the hell out of anti-war protesters. Why? They're making $100 an hour. In their minds, it affected their consciousness, right? It affected their consciousness. And so even though they had to fight to get that $100 an hour, they still in their minds thought, I'm making $100 an hour. I'm going to team up with my boss against these people in Vietnam and these people in Asia and these black people and others. And that is labor aristocracy, is that when they're making so much more than other workers, it affects their consciousness and they become less revolutionary. They also think, hey, why would I want a revolution? I'm making $100 an hour. We got a good gig going on here. So they become less militant on the job because, because they're making better wages. And on top of that, they become less sympathetic to workers around the world. They see the black people, these construction trades used to be all white, and they would see black people and they would treat them badly. And they'd say, I'm making $100 an hour, get away from me, N-word. It affected their mindset. It got to their head. This is the labor aristocracy, right? And that's what labor aristocracy is. So labor aristocracy is the natural result of the fact that Western capitalism, in the Western imperialist centers, you have big corporations that are reaping super profits from all over the world. And because of that, you tend to have the ability of the capitalists to pay some workers higher than others, and that affects their consciousness, and they no longer have solidarity with the people around the world. That's what labor aristocracy is. And so the idea, it's not consciously created. The capitalists don't sit there and dream it up. It just kind of happens, right? And that's a lot of things. You need to think less like a conspiracy theorist. You need to understand that a lot of things just happen as a result of the economy, right? That these are the natural workings of a system where one class is struggling against another class. Profits are being made. Corporations are trying to make higher profits. That's how these things work. It's not a vast conspiratorial plot, right? And that's the labor aristocracy, right? That's what labor aristocracy is, the Leninist concept. So, I mean, right now, the labor aristocracy is being demolished largely because in a lot of areas, they don't need them anymore, right? They talk about auto workers. Auto workers used to get paid higher wages, now they need fewer and fewer workers. And that, they've created a global apparatus of production. They're competing with workers in Mexico. They're competing with workers all over the world, And so now they don't need this layer of well-paid auto workers in the United States. And it's not like a conspiracy. And it's not like they're going to sit there and go, oh, we've got a problem with the falling rate of profit. I know, we'll regenerate the labor aristocracy. No, that's not how these things work. This is the normal development of an irrational system based on profits. It's not a conspiracy. That's my point. All right, next question. George A. Romero and Dawn of the Dead. Well, Dawn of the Dead, right? So Night of the Living Dead is the first movie. And that's a movie that was filmed in Ohio. It's a horror movie. And it's a very low budget movie, but it's very good. It's about like a zombie apocalypse, and these people all hide in this house. Very good. And then from what I understand, Dawn of the Dead is the sequel. And it's continuing the zombie apocalypse, and the people hide in a mall. And they're hiding in a mall to be protected from the zombie apocalypse. And it's kind of the irony is there's so much stuff, right? There's this high consumption society. They're in this mall, but it's all empty, and they're hiding in this mall from the zombie apocalypse. And spoiler alert, spoiler alert, then some stupid bikers show up and smash the windows and break open the mall, and then the zombies get in and ruin everything. And I guess it's a statement that the problem isn't the zombie apocalypse. The problem, it's us. There's going to be stupid bikers who ruin everything. And look, we have all this wealth, but yet we have poverty and inequality. And yeah, it's a critique of consumer society, I would say. It's more of a new left critique. How should socialists respond to accusations that Russia is using social media companies to influence elections? All right. So there you go. All right. Caleb, thanks for your great work. Could you please talk about the Naxalites and their ongoing struggle in India? Oh, I'm going to disappoint you here, Lionel, but that's okay. All right. Naxalites. All right. Okay. All right. Kemal Ataturk, he was the founder of modern Turkey. Blessed is he who says, I am a Turk. He was a leader of the Turkish people. He established the modern Turkey. He aligned with the Soviet Union as kind of a nationalist. He was not a socialist, not a Marxist, definitely a bourgeois nationalist, but he was aligned with the Soviet Union, created the basis of modern Turkey. Sometimes he was sympathetic to the Marxists. Other times he was suppressing them and against them. He's just a bourgeois nationalist leader. He's kind of like, Dr. Sun Yat-sen or Chiang Kai-shek. He's kind of like, there's many figures, right? You could compare him now to Erdogan, You compare him to, I mean, he was different than Erdogan because Erdogan is religious, whereas Ataturk was very, very secular, and he was really opposed to religion. Like that, I mean, he would suppress anyone who talked about building a religious government in Turkey. It's a very serious crime in Turkey to advocate a religious government. Kemal Ataturk was much more secular, as a secular nationalist inspired by the French Revolution. But you compare him to Modi, you can compare him to Duterte, not a communist, but he was an anti-imperialist, and he built modern Turkey. And because he was fighting the imperialists, that caused him to sometimes align with the Soviet Union and other times to not. He went back and forth, and that's what bourgeois nationalist forces do. All righty. All righty. Yoy, yoy, yoy. All right. Next question. Are the tech workers of Silicon Valley liberal? My understanding is that among employees of tech companies, not the tech owners, not Mark Zuckerberg, not Bill Gates, but among the employees, there's like a stereotype of a libertarian dude bro who's into Bitcoin and is into Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand and is interested in the alt-right, and that a lot of those people a lot of the Silicon Valley employees tend to be libertarian-ish. However, wokeism has gotten pushed more and more in Silicon Valley as well. There's a lot more wokeism, and that comes from the top. I mean, it's not like, your average tech bro who's been working at Google for years and years and years is not woke. But the companies overall have adopted kind of a socially liberal outlook. So yeah, there you go. My understanding is that libertarian kind of politics are very big among Silicon Valley employees, but honestly, I don't know. I haven't done a poll. So there you go. All right. Russia using social media to influence elections. Social media influences elections, folks. I mean, the social media giants are using social media to influence elections. I mean, there was that company in Russia, the hot dog company or whatever, they said was somehow trying to influence elections on behalf of the Russian government. And they actually proved in court they weren't doing that. You can actually read about that case. They sued and they said, no, there may have been some, company in Russia, but it wasn't a government company. And the guy involved was not doing it on behalf of the Russian government. And, and so you can look into the details that fell apart. And the idea that Trump got elected because some memes, of Jesus wrestling with the devil or something were paid for by, that's ridiculous. You read these reports, the more you read these reports, there's nothing in them. There's nothing in them. The more you read these reports about Russian meddling, I'm sorry, I had to read all these reports as a reporter. I would print them out every time the FBI would publish a new document, every time the State Department would, I would read them, and there's nothing in them. Like, do you really think there were people that were going to vote for Hillary Clinton? Then they saw this stupid meme of Jesus arm wrestling with the devil, and they said, oh shit, I'm going to vote for Trump. Didn't happen. Meanwhile, Google and Facebook and Twitter, with their algorithms, they do have an impact on elections. And they've been caught very blatantly meddling in elections throughout the United States. The tech giants do have an agenda of their own. And if anyone is using using social media to influence elections, it's the tech giants. All right, next question. And you talk about the Naxalites and their struggle in India. I can, but you're not going to like what I have to say, which is that the Naxalites today are not playing a good role, in my opinion. In India, you have the second largest industrial working class in the world. China has the biggest industrial working class. The second largest is in India. All kinds of factory workers, all kinds of working class people. And the Naxalites don't want to organize the industrial working class of India. They want to do the people's war thing in the countryside. And that's not a good strategy. And that, there's huge labor unions in India. There's huge communist parties. Kerala is run by the Communist Party of India Marxists. There's also the Communist Party of India. There's also the Socialist Unity Center of India. There's huge communist groups in India. And the Naxalites don't align with them. They murder them. They assassinate communist leaders in India. They go around doing that. They think they're revisionists and they assassinate them. And it really gets back to what Fidel Castro wrote in his critique of the FARC, which is that, when the Naxalites started in Naxalbari, that's why they're called Naxalites, is there was an area called Naxalbari where there was like a Maoist communist uprising in the 1960s. And these groups at that point, in response to this Maoist communist uprising in India, In response to that, they started waging like guerrilla warfare in the countryside, trying to carve out liberated territory. But that was the 1960s, and they've been doing it ever since then. And they haven't been gaining any ground. In Andhra Pradesh, which is the region, they haven't been gaining any ground. They've gotten weaker. They've gotten more fractured. There's different factions among them. And at this point, for a lot of them, being a rebel has become a way of life. It's kind of like Jesse James. You know who Jesse James was? Jesse James was a Confederate. He was a Confederate guerrilla, right? He was on the side of the Confederacy, and he was fighting Union Army soldiers. And then the war ended. And the war ended. He killed a bunch of Union Army soldiers. He couldn't just go back to civilian life, so he became an outlaw. And in a lot of cases, that's what the Naxals are. I mean, they're not Confederates, obviously. They're fighting for the oppressed and for the peasantry. But the war is over. I mean, there's not going to be a Maoist communist revolution in India. I mean, I'm sorry. Look, I mean, it's been, how long has it been and so there's not going to be a Maoist communist revolution in India. So these guys are just kind of stuck in the woods. And a lot of them are basically robbing people as a way of surviving. They rob people. They attack government workers and steal stuff. They raid government buildings. They attack people. They're just kind of, it's like what they can do. But, and it's kind of similar to what happened with the Black Panthers. There's a great documentary that was on HBO called Bastards of the Party. And then after the Black Panther Party was broken up, a lot of the revolutionary Black nationalist forces degenerated into the rise in gangs in the 80s. Because if you're on the outs with the government, right? If you're engaged in criminal activity and all that, you can't, even if it starts out as for a revolutionary purpose, if the war ends and there's no like amnesty or truce, you can't just walk back into civilian life. And so what started out as armed struggle degenerates into criminality. And that's not good, right? If the Naxals were serious about a revolution in India, they would find a way to get the Communist Party of India Marxist on their side, to get the trade unions on their side, to get the Socialist Unity Center on their side. But they're not doing that. They're murdering those people. And they assassinate leaders of trade unions. And they're operating in the countryside, in the rural countryside, trying to do this 1930s Mao thing. And if you look at the demographics of Indian society, that's not a good strategy. I'm sorry, but the rural peasantry of India are not going to make the revolution. You have a huge industrial working class. And, Mao, in his theory of the People's War, he talked about how in the countryside, you organize the countryside until you reach what's called strategic equilibrium, which is where you have enough forces in the countryside. You then, after you've reached strategic equilibrium, you go into the cities and you build a united front in the cities with the trade unions, with others, right? And you use the rural base areas to be the basis for organizing a movement in the cities that is in alliance with the liberated territory in the countryside. They're not doing that. They're murdering all the people, the leftists in the cities. They're violent, and it's a lot like Sendero Luminoso in Peru, right? These are ultra left groups, and they may have started out as revolutionaries back in the 60s, back when India had when there was much more of the country was in the countryside, much more of the population was in the countryside. But at this point, now there's a huge industrial working class in India, and they have completely cut themselves off from it, and they're waging armed struggle in the countryside, and they've been doing that for 40, 50 years and haven't gained any ground, and I'm not thrilled with them. But, this could change. Who knows? Maybe the Naxals could reorient their tactics. Maybe, they could enter a united front. But at this point, I'm not a big fan of the Naxals. I look at them and I think, not good. Not good, right? If you're serious in India, you need to be organizing the workers and the farmers, right? There was just this huge uprising of farmers in India, right? It was a great uprising. And, a lot of farmers were involved in it and all of that. And the Naxals, I guess they supported it, which is good. They weren't completely hostile to it. They didn't call it social fascist because, it wasn't in the name of the one true party, Mao or something, so that's good. So who knows? Things could change. I know Arundhati Roy wrote an interesting article about the Naxals a couple years ago. And so there you go. Yeah, I guess that's all I got to say about that. All right, folks. I think we're going. It's been fun. Have a good night. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution ain't. All right, folks, the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, but revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action to fight for working families, a government of action that will fight for working families. Dare to struggle, dare to win. The danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, but revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night. Good night.